My name is Sylvia. For a long time I was a ghost dressed in sensible shoes. A woman whose name carried no weight in the hallways where I gave my heart, my sweat, and my best ideas. I chose to be invisible because I believed that merit was a silent roar. I believed that if I worked hard enough the world would eventually see me. But I was wrong. I learned the hard way that when you make yourself small, small men will try to trample you. Before we begin this journey of shadows and light, I want to pause and say a heartfelt thank you. Thank you for being here. In a world that is always shouting, your choice to listen to a story of quiet resilience is a gift I do not take lightly. I am truly humbled by your presence. If you have ever felt overlooked, if you have ever been the floorboard for someone else's ascent, this story is for you. It is a reminder that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to stand its ground. If my journey touches the quiet corners of your heart today, I invite you to join our community of strength by subscribing to Queen's Revenge. And to those of you who have already walked this path with me and hit that subscribe button, may your life be an endless river of abundance. May your wealth grow beyond your wildest dreams, and may your heart be so full of happiness that it radiates to everyone you touch. This is my story. This is how the girl who was uninvited finally came home. The air in Mr. Hartman's office didn't just circulate. It felt curated, pressurized by an ego that demanded every molecule pay tribute to his status. It smelled of expensive mahogany polish and a cologne that was far too aggressive, a scent that shouted success to drown out the whisper of incompetence. I stood in the doorway, my spine a rigid line of feigned composure. My hands were folded neatly in front of me, a gesture of practiced grace that felt, in that moment, like a shield made of glass. I was smiling, that polite corporate mask I had perfected over 3 years, even as I felt the first hairline fractures spreading across my soul. "Sylvia," he began, his voice dripping with a synthetic, saccharine sympathy that made my skin crawl. He didn't look up from the gold-rimmed fountain pen he was twirling between his manicured fingers. "You've done adequate work this quarter. Truly, the Peterson account was a nice win." Adequate. The word was a calculated insult, a dull blade meant to bruise rather than clean-cut. I had stayed until 3 a.m. for 3 weeks to secure Peterson. I had saved this firm from a 6-figure deficit while Hartman was playing golf in the Hamptons. "Thank you, sir," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was a frantic bird battering itself against the cage of my ribs. Finally he looked up. His eyes were cold, assessing me not as a professional, but as a piece of office furniture that didn't quite match the aesthetic of his ambitions. However, regarding the executive retreat to the Azure Crescent Island Resort, I've decided to move forward with the senior leads only. And Marcus, a man whose greatest contribution to the firm was knowing which Scotch Hartman preferred. "I understand the criteria was based on performance metrics," I said softly, the heat of humiliation beginning to flicker in the pit of my stomach. Hartman leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like a predatory growl. "Metrics are for the back office, Sylvia. This retreat is about caliber. It's for executives with a certain presence. Oh wait, people who belong in a space that refined. Presence." The word didn't just hurt, it incinerated. He was telling me that I was a ghost in my own life. He was saying that my modesty, the very thing I had chosen to preserve my integrity, was being used as evidence of my insignificance. To him, my used car, my lack of designer labels, and my quiet efficiency weren't signs of character. They were symptoms of a low-caliber existence. He waved a hand dismissively, as if brushing away a persistent fly. "The Azure Crescent isn't just a hotel, Sylvia. It's an ecosystem of power. You'd simply feel out of place. It's a kindness, really. I'm sparing you the discomfort of being the person who doesn't fit in." The irony was a jagged pill that I refused to swallow. I looked past him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a long accusatory shadow across his desk. That spotlight didn't feel like a blessing, it felt like an interrogation. Beyond the glass walls of his office, the bullpen was unervingly quiet. My coworkers, people I had helped, mentored, and shielded from Hartman's tantrums, were suddenly very busy with their monitors. Their silence was a physical weight. It was the sound of complicity. No one looked up. No one cleared their throat in protest. They were all vultures, waiting for the carcass of my dignity to be picked clean so they could claim the scraps of my workload. I felt a sudden sharp pang of memory, a ghost limb of a life I had amputated. The Azure Crescent. Hartman spoke the name with a reverence usually reserved for deities. He didn't know that I knew the exact temperature of the infinity pool at dawn. He didn't know that the scent of the lobby, sandalwood and sea salt, was the scent of my childhood. He didn't know that the architect who designed those soaring limestone arches had sat at our dinner table and sketched the blueprints on a napkin while I watched wide-eyed. That resort wasn't just a destination. It was my father's masterpiece. It was a piece of my heritage, a place where the staff knew my favorite flavor of gelato, and where I had learned that true power doesn't need to shout. And here was this small, arrogant man, telling me I wasn't good enough to walk on floors my family had laid. "I understand, Mr. Hartman," I said, and for the first time the polite smile slipped. What replaced it wasn't a frown, but a cold, crystalline clarity. "Do you?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had broken me. He thought the moisture in my eyes was a prelude to tears of shame. He didn't realize they were tears of mourning. I was mourning the woman I had tried to be for 3 years, the woman who believed that merit was enough, that hard work was a silent roar, and that anonymity was a virtue. I had spent 3 years trying to build a life from scratch, wanting to prove that Sylvia, just Sylvia, was enough. I wanted to earn my seat at the table without my father's shadow pulling the chair out for me. I had lived in a cramped apartment with a leaky faucet and worn shoes that made my arches ache, all for the sake of an ideal. But as I stood in the doorway of that mahogany-scented cage, watching my boss gloat over his petty exclusion, I realized that I hadn't been proving my strength. I had been feeding his ego. My silence hadn't been dignity. It had been an invitation for his cruelty. "I do understand," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, becoming a smooth, dangerous velvet. "I understand exactly what you value, sir. And I understand the kind of presence you think is required for the Azure Crescent." He blinked, momentarily unnerved by the shift in my tone. The air in the room seemed to chill. "Good," he muttered, looking back down at his paperwork to regain his sense of dominance. "You're dismissed, Sylvia. Make sure the quarterly reports are on Marcus's desk before the team leaves for the airport on Monday. You'll be holding down the fort while we're away." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't point out that Marcus couldn't even format a spreadsheet without help. I turned and walked out of the office. Every step felt like I was shedding a skin that no longer fit. As I walked through the rows of desks, the silence of my coworkers followed me like a shroud. I saw Sarah, who I'd covered for when her daughter was sick, staring intently at a blank screen. I saw David, whose career I'd saved 3 months ago, suddenly fascinated by his coffee mug. Their betrayal was the final stitch in the shroud of my old life. I reached my desk, picked up my modest, unbranded purse and walked toward the elevators. I didn't wait for the end of the day. I didn't say goodbye. As the elevator doors slid shut, reflecting my pale, determined face, I reached into my bag and pulled out a secondary phone. One I hadn't switched on in months. I had spent 3 years running away from a name. I had spent 3 years letting people like Hartman believe they were superior because they had the loudest voices and the most expensive suits. The elevator hit the lobby. I stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and silver. Anonymity had been my sanctuary, but today it had become my prison. And as I dialed a number I knew by heart, I realized that some cages are meant to be burned down. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling only slightly as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The day I walked away from the Sullivan Crest, I felt the air in my lungs expand for the first time in 22 years. I remember the look on my father's face, not one of anger, but of a profound, quiet bewilderment. To him the empire was a fortress, a legacy carved in limestone and glass. To me, it was a gilded cage where every breath was subsidized by a bank account I hadn't earned. I didn't want to be an heiress. I wanted to be a person. I wanted to know if the world would still look at me if I wasn't standing on a mountain of gold. So I traded the marble halls for a 1-bedroom apartment in a part of the city where the streetlights flickered like dying stars. I traded the silk sheets for cotton that grew thinner with every wash. I chose a name that carried no weight, just Sylvia. No Sullivan. No legacy. Just a girl with a degree and a desperate need to prove that her pulse mattered more than her pedigree. For 3 years, I lived a life that was skeletal in its simplicity. My apartment smelled of rain-dampened concrete and the cheap, burnt coffee I drank to stay awake while I polished campaigns for a man who didn't know the first thing about creativity. I drove a used sedan with a dent in the passenger door, and a heater that sighed like a weary old man. To me, these things were badges of honor. Every rattle of the engine was a reminder that I was doing it on my own. It felt honest. It felt pure. But I was naive. I hadn't yet learned that in the corporate jungle, honesty is often mistaken for a lack of predator instinct. When I first walked into Hartman's firm, I arrived with a portfolio that bled brilliance. I had ideas that were architectural in their complexity and visceral in their emotional pull. I thought that would be enough. I thought merit was a beacon that could shine through any fog. Mr. Hartman, however, didn't see light. He only saw shadows. He was a man who measured a person's intellect by the brand of their watch and the cut of their blazer. Because I wore off-the-rack suits and didn't drop names of exclusive country clubs during lunch, he categorized me as safe. To him, my modesty wasn't a choice. It was a limitation. He looked at my used car and my quiet demeanor and saw a girl who was lucky to be in the room, rather than the woman who was keeping the room afloat. The parasitism began almost immediately. I remember the first time it happened, the Aura campaign. I had spent 48 hours straight crafting a narrative that turned a simple skincare line into a manifesto on self-worth. It was beautiful. It was revolutionary. "This is interesting, Sylvia," Hartman had said in the privacy of his office, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger as he looked at my sketches. "Raw. Unpolished, of course, but there's a spark. Leave it with me. I'll see if I can salvage it." 2 days later, I sat in the boardroom as a ghost. I watched him present my heart, my words, and my strategy to the board. He didn't even change the font. He stood there, soaking in the applause, basking in the genius of a vision he hadn't spent a single second conceiving. He took the credit, the bonus, and the accolades while I sat at the edge of the table, taking the minutes of the meeting. I stayed silent. I told myself it was the price of anonymity. I believed that if I kept delivering, if I kept being the invisible engine, eventually the truth would be too large to ignore. I believed in the nobility of the grind. How foolish I was. In Hartman's world, I wasn't an employee. I was a resource to be mined until I was hollow. He began to treat my talent as his personal property. He would praise me in whispers behind closed doors, a manipulative tactic to keep me tethered. "You're my secret weapon, Sylvia," he'd say, a greasy smile stretching across his face. "The world isn't ready for your presence yet, but don't worry. I'll carry the weight for you." That was his favorite word, presence. To Hartman, presence wasn't about what you brought to the table. It was about how much space you occupied with your ego. Because I didn't perform the theater of wealth, because I didn't participate in the toxic posturing of the executive suite, he decided I was invisible. He misinterpreted my lack of vanity as a lack of ambition. He saw my silence not as observation but as vacancy. The 3 years of my honest life began to feel less like a journey of self-discovery and more like a slow, agonizing erasure. My coworkers followed his lead. They became the mirrors that reflected his distorted view of me. I became the girl who did the work but didn't exist in the photos. I was the person they called when a deadline was looming, but the one they forgot to include in the celebratory drinks. I endured the stinging comments about my thrifty wardrobe. I endured the way Marcus would talk over me in meetings, repeating my points 5 minutes after I made them, only to be met with nods of approval that I never received. I endured it all because I thought the finish line was just over the next hill. I thought that one day, I would be rewarded for the purity of my struggle. But the retreat announcement didn't just move the finish line. It incinerated it. Watching Hartman stand before the company, announcing a trip to my home, the Azure Crescent, as if he were the gatekeeper of paradise, was a betrayal that went beyond professional theft. It was a violation of my sanctuary. The resort was the one place where I had felt seen, not as an heiress but as a child who loved the sea. It was the place where the Sullivan name meant hospitality, warmth, and excellence. And now, Hartman was using it as a tool for exclusion. He was using my father's legacy to tell me I wasn't good enough to exist in the very world I had been born to lead. The realization was a cold, sharp blade to the gut. Merit is a myth in a world governed by status. You can be the sun, but if people are committed to looking at the moon because it's silver-plated, you will always be in the dark. I looked at my hands, callous from 3 years of honest work, and felt a wave of nausea. I had tried to prove I could succeed without my name. I had tried to be just Sylvia. And in doing so, I had allowed myself to be trampled by a man who wasn't fit to polish my father's shoes. I had refused my name to find my soul. But I realize now that by hiding my identity, I had given Hartman the power to define it for me. He saw my modesty as mediocrity. He saw my hard work as a lack of caliber. He didn't know that the girl he was treating like a footstool was the daughter of the man who owned the sky he was flying under. As I walked out of the office that day, the weight of the Sullivan name no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a weapon. A beautiful, sharp, and long overdue weapon. For 3 years I had been the girl who didn't exist. Now it was time to show them that when a ghost decides to stop being invisible, she becomes a haunting they can never escape. Good enough for. The boardroom felt like a pressurized chamber, the kind where the oxygen is slowly being replaced by the intoxicating fumes of corporate vanity. The air conditioning hummed with a clinical, unfeeling efficiency, vibrating against the glass walls like a low-grade fever. We were all gathered there, a sea of white shirts and desperate ambitions, waiting for the carrot to be dangled. I sat near the back, my posture a silent prayer of invisibility, my notebook open to a page filled with the meticulous details of the Peterson account, the account that had single-handedly kept our department's profit margins in the black this quarter. I felt a flicker of quiet hope, a dangerous thing in a place like this. I had worked myself to the bone. I had sacrificed sleep, sanity, and the last remnants of my social life to prove my worth. Surely, even a man as blinded by status as Hartman couldn't ignore the raw data of my success. Everyone, Hartman announced, his voice booming with a performative joviality that set my teeth on edge. He stood at the head of the table, his silhouette framed by a digital presentation that was about to change the trajectory of my life. As a reward for our stellar collective effort, I am thrilled to announce this year's Executive Leadership Retreat. He hit a button on the remote. The screen flickered to life, and the room collective inhaled. It was a panoramic shot of the Azure Crescent Island Resort. The image was so sharp, so vibrant, that for a second, I could almost smell the brine of the Indian Ocean and the heady sweet scent of the night-blooming jasmine that lined the walkways. I saw the limestone villas cascading down the cliffside like a spill of pearls, and the infinity pool that seemed to bleed directly into the horizon. A horizon I had spent months debating the exact shade of blue for with the chief architect during my senior year of college. My heart didn't just beat, it thrashed. This was my father's flagship. This was the place where I had spent my summers learning the skeletal structure of luxury. Not as a consumer, but as a creator. I had helped design the layout of the very gardens Hartman was now pointing to with a smug, proprietary grin. The Azure Crescent, Hartman breathed, the name rolling off his tongue like a prayer to a god he didn't deserve to know. The most exclusive destination in the hemisphere. A place where caliber isn't just a word, it's a lifestyle. The room erupted into whispers of awe and envy. My coworkers gazed at the screen as if it were a portal to a heaven they were desperate to enter. I, however, felt a cold, oily dread beginning to pool in my stomach. I knew what was coming. I saw the way Hartman's eyes flicked toward me. A quick, predatory glance that lasted only a fraction of a second but carried the weight of a death sentence. Now, Hartman continued, his voice dropping into a tone of faux gravity. Due to the extreme exclusivity of the resort, the guest list is limited. We've had to make some very difficult choices based on the presence and strategic value of our team members. The slide changed. A list of names appeared in elegant sans serif font. Marcus Thorne, Sarah Jenkins, David Miller, Jonathan Hayes. I scanned the list, my eyes darting frantically, searching for the 6 letters that defined my existence. Nothing. I looked again, slower this time. Perhaps I had missed it. Perhaps it was on the next page. But there was no next page. The list ended with Marcus, a man who had spent the last month taking credit for my research and mentoring the interns by teaching them how to fetch his dry cleaning. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of a room waiting for more information. It was the silence of a firing squad that had just missed the target and was reloading. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold and brittle. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. My name hadn't been forgotten in the rush of planning. It had been systematically, surgically removed. I looked at Hartman. He was already looking at me. He didn't look away. Instead, he allowed a thin, razor-edged smile to curl the corners of his mouth. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had turned my exclusion into a public spectacle. He had stood in front of the entire company and signaled that I was the other. The one who didn't belong, the one whose caliber was so lacking that I wasn't even worth a seat at the table I had helped build. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I had secured the Peterson account. I had done the work of 3 people. And his response was to banish me from my own home. "If your name isn't on the list," Hartman said, his voice echoing with a hollow metallic ring, "it simply means we feel your talents are better utilized here, maintaining the foundation of the firm while the leadership team focuses on higher-level networking. It's about balance. Foundation." He was calling me a floorboard. Something to be walked upon so that others could reach the ceiling. I looked around the table waiting for anyone to speak up. I looked at Sarah, whom I had comforted when she was passed over for a promotion last year. She kept her eyes fixed on her tablet. I looked at David, whose mortgage I had essentially paid by fixing his disastrous presentation for the regional director. He suddenly found the grain of the mahogany table fascinating. Their silence was a physical blow. It was the sound of my value being appraised and found wanting by the very people I had supported. They knew it was wrong. They knew I deserved to be on that list more than any of them. But the allure of the Azure Crescent, the promise of being in the in crowd, was a much stronger currency than loyalty or justice. At that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It hardened. The grief I had been carrying for 3 years, the sadness of being underestimated, the exhaustion of the honest grind, crystallized into a cold, sharp diamond of resolve. Hartman thought he was teaching me a lesson in humility. He thought he was putting me in my place. He didn't realize that by uninviting me from the Azure Crescent, he had inadvertently invited the Sullivan back into the room. He had made the exclusion a spectacle. Fine. I would make the revelation a symphony. I didn't lower my gaze. I didn't let the tears that were burning my eyes fall. I met his stare with a stillness that seemed to unsettle him for a fleeting second. "Is there a problem, Sylvia?" he asked, his voice laced with a mocking concern. "You look a bit overwhelmed." "No problem at all, Mr. Hartman," I said, my voice coming out as a cool, steady silver. "I was just admiring the resort. It really is a masterpiece of design. I'm sure the experience will be exactly what you deserve." He chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "I'm glad you see it that way. Now let's get back to work. Those Peterson reports won't file themselves." I walked out of that room not as a victim but as an architect. I had spent 3 years trying to prove I belonged in his world. But as I watched him boast about a luxury he didn't understand, I realized I had been aiming far too low. If they believed I didn't belong at the resort, then they were about to learn that the only reason they were allowed through the front gates was because my family had decided to be generous. The night was a suffocating shroud, thick with the smell of damp asphalt and the distant, mocking wail of a siren. I sat on the edge of my thrift store bed, the springs groaning under a weight that wasn't physical, but metaphysical. My small apartment, once a sanctuary of my self-imposed honesty, now felt like a tomb. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, curling like the edges of a burnt letter, and the single light bulb overhead hummed with a low, dying frequency that vibrated in my teeth. I looked at my hands. They were shaking, not with fear, but with the sheer, jagged electricity of a humiliation that refused to settle. Hartman's voice, that oily, condescending caliber, was an echo I couldn't scrub from my mind. It was a poison that had finally reached my marrow. For 3 years, I had been the architect of my own invisibility. I had built this life of scarcity out of a stubborn, perhaps even arrogant, desire to be just Sylvia. I had wanted to prove that my worth wasn't a byproduct of my father's balance sheet. But tonight, standing in the wreckage of my pride, I realized that I hadn't been proving my strength. I had been feeding a monster. I had handed my light to a man who used it to blind me. The phone felt heavy in my hand, A piece of dark obsidian. I rarely called him. Our relationship was a delicate architecture of mutual respect and distant love, predicated on the agreement that I would find my own way. To call him now felt like an admission of defeat. Felt like breaking a vow. But as I looked at the bruise on my ego, I realized that some vows are meant to be broken when the world tries to break you first. I hit the contact name I hadn't touched in months. It didn't even have a name, just a single sharp initial. The ringing was a rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat from another world. On the third ring he picked up. Sylvia. His voice was like aged scotch, smooth, warm, but with a burn at the back of it that reminded you of its potency. Arthur Sullivan didn't sound like a billionaire. He sounded like a man who owned the concept of time itself. "Hi, Dad," I whispered. My voice broke on the second syllable, a tiny, pathetic splinter of sound in the dark room. The silence on the other end was instantaneous and absolute. My father didn't need to ask if something was wrong. He could hear the 3 years of suppressed exhaustion in that one breath. "Tell me," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command to release the weight. And so I told him. I told him about the marketing firm that thrived on my blood but choked on my name. I told him about the stolen campaigns, the quiet erasures, and the way my coworkers looked through me as if I were a window rather than a woman. I told him about the meeting today, the azure crescent, the slide of names, and the word caliber. As I spoke, the silence on the line shifted. It wasn't the silence of listening anymore. It was the silence of a gathering storm. It was the sound of a monolith deciding where to fall. When I finished, I could hear his breathing, slow, rhythmic, and terrifyingly calm. "Mr. Hartman," my father said, the name sounding like something foul he was tasting for the first time. "He said you lacked presence in my house. He doesn't know, Dad. He thinks I'm just a girl with a used car and a lack of executive weight. I can end him, Sylvia," my father said, and there was no heat in his voice, only the cold, clinical certainty of a predator. One phone call to the board of directors. One audit. One whisper in the right ear, and he will be out on the street by Monday morning, wondering why the world suddenly stopped turning for him. I can burn that firm to the ground and buy the ashes just to scatter them. The offer was tempting. It was a siren song of easy justice. I could almost see Hartman's face draining of color as his world collapsed. I could feel the vicarious thrill of his ruin. But I shook my head, even though my father couldn't see me. "No," I said, my voice finally finding its edge. "I don't want to rescue, Dad. I don't want you to end him. Not like that. That's too fast. That's too merciful. Then what do you want?" I looked at the peeling wallpaper, at the flickering light bulb, and then out the window toward the horizon where I knew the ocean was waiting. "I want truth to introduce itself. He thinks the azure crescent is a playground for people of his caliber. He thinks he's earned the right to walk those halls while I stay behind and sweep the floors. I want him to go. I want the whole team to go. I want them to arrive in paradise believing they are the masters of the universe." I paused, a cold, sharp smile finally touching my lips. "And then I want them to see who actually owns the keys." On the other end of the line, I heard it, the low, soft rumble of my father's laugh. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, the laugh of a man who recognized his own blood. It was the sound of the Sullivan legacy waking up. "My brave, foolish girl," he murmured. "You stayed away so long I thought you'd forgotten how to bite. But you haven't. You've just been sharpening your teeth in the dark. I'm done hiding, Dad. I'm done pretending that my humility is a virtue when it's being used as a doormat." "Good," he said, and I could practically hear him clicking a pen, a sound that usually preceded a billion-dollar merger. "Consider it done. I'll notify the resort manager personally. Within 10 minutes, the presidential villa, the one with the private beach and the limestone terrace you designed, will be reserved for the duration of their retreat. In your name, Sylvia Sullivan." "Thank you, Dad." "Don't thank me," he said, his voice softening with a rare, raw tenderness. "I've spent 3 years watching you try to be small, Sylvia. It hurt more than I ever told you. Welcome back to the light. And Sylvia? Don't be gentle with them. The azure crescent was built for lions, not for men who play at being kings." When I hung up, the apartment felt different. The peeling wallpaper didn't look like decay anymore. It looked like a skin I was ready to shed. The hum of the light bulb sounded like a fanfare. I walked to the small, cracked mirror in my bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The woman looking back at me was no longer the adequate employee. She wasn't the girl who apologized for taking up space. Her eyes were hard, reflecting a fire that had been smoldering beneath the ice for 1,000 days. Hartman wanted presence? He wanted caliber? He was about to find out that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting the loudest. It's the one who knows exactly how the foundation was poured. I went to my closet and pulled out a small locked suitcase I hadn't opened since the day I left my father's house. I clicked the code my birthday and the lid hissed open. Inside, nestled in acid-free paper, was a single dress of deep, midnight silk, and a pair of heels that looked like they were carved from obsidian. I wouldn't be arriving on the company shuttle. I wouldn't be checking in with the group. The stage was set. The invitations were out. And for the first time in 3 years I wasn't just Sylvia. I was a Sullivan. And in my father's house, there is only one caliber that matters: the truth. I lay down that night and for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of spreadsheets or deadlines. I dreamed of the tide coming in, cold and relentless, washing away the footprints of small men who thought they could own the sea. The final week before the retreat was draped in a silence so profound it felt liturgical. To the rest of the office, the air was electric with the frantic, giddy energy of packing and prestige. My coworkers moved through the hallways like atoms in a state of high-velocity excitement, their conversations revolving around resort wear, SPF ratings, and which executive they hoped to accidentally corner at the poolside bar. But for me, the world had slowed down to a sterile surgical crawl. Mr. Hartman, emboldened by his impending victory, had abandoned even the pretense of professional courtesy. He treated the office like a kingdom he was about to vacate, and me like the servant tasked with scrubbing the floors while the court was away. "Sylvia," he said on Tuesday morning, dropping a stack of folders onto my desk that hit with the heavy thud of a gavel. He didn't even stop walking. "These are the projections for the next 3 quarters. Since you won't be distracted by the island festivities, I expect a full forensic analysis by the time we return. It's important work. The kind of work that requires a steady, invisible hand." He paused at the door, glancing back with a smirk that was a masterclass in casual cruelty. "Think of it as your own private retreat. Just you, the data, and the quiet. I imagine the office will be much more peaceful without the executives around to clutter things up." I looked up from the folders and offered him a smile, a thin, translucent veil of a thing. "It will be very quiet, Mr. Hartman. I'll make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be when you get back." Inside, the fire I had lit during that phone call to my father wasn't raging. It was refining. It was a blue flame, steady and hot enough to vaporize the very air he breathed. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is chaotic. Anger is loud. What I felt now was clarity. A cold, crystalline understanding of the anatomy of my own suffering. Every time Hartman made a joke at my expense, every time he referred to my modest temperament or my lack of edge, I didn't flinch. I took it as a data point. I spent my evenings not packing a suitcase but building an archive. I sat at my desk long after the cleaners had come and gone, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes like a digital ghost. I began to pull the threads of the last 3 years, unspooling the tapestry of my career at this firm. I created a file. I titled it simply, "The Caliber of Justice." I started with the Aura campaign. I found the original timestamps of my drafts, the emails where I had shared my conceptual breakthroughs with Hartman in confidence, and the subsequent presentation where he had stripped my name from the credits like a scavenger picking meat from a bone. Then came the Peterson account. I documented the 18-hour days I had spent in the archives, the way I had personally negotiated the terms that saved the firm, and the memo Hartman had sent to the board afterward, attributing the entire success to Marcus's relentless leadership. But it wasn't just the stolen work. It was the atmospheric toxicity. I transcribed the comments. I noted the dates I was excluded from strategy meetings I had prepared. I logged the instances where my gender and my perceived low status were used as justifications for my erasure. October 14th. Hartman told me I lacked the aesthetic weight for the client dinner. January 22nd. Marcus was given the lead on the Reynolds project despite having no prior experience in the sector. March 3rd. Hartman referred to my clothes as sensible for a girl of my station. By Thursday, the file was nearly 100 pages long. It was a ledger of 1,000 tiny cuts. Reading through it was like performing an autopsy on my own spirit. I saw how I had let them diminish me, piece by piece, believing that my silence was a form of strength. I saw how I had allowed my humility to be weaponized against me. It was heartbreaking to see 3 years of my life, my passion, my intellect, my heart, reduced to a list of grievances and stolen ideas. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the version of Sylvia who had walked into this office 3 years ago, full of hope and a misguided belief in the purity of merit. I wanted to reach through time and hold her hand. I wanted to tell her that she didn't have to be a martyr to be a masterpiece. And yet, as the file grew thicker, I felt an inexplicable lightness. It was the lightness of a surgeon who has finally located the tumor. By naming the injustice, I had stripped it of its power to haunt me. It was no longer a vague, heavy cloud hanging over my life. It was a document. It was evidence. It was a weapon that was being polished to a mirror shine. The truth, I realized, is a patient thing. It doesn't need to scream to be heard. It just needs a stage and the right lighting. Hartman had provided the stage, the Azure Crescent. My father had provided the lighting, the presidential villa. And I was providing the script. On Friday afternoon, the office was a chaos of departures. The executives were leaving early for their private jet. Marcus was strutting around in a designer linen suit that looked like it cost more than my first car. Sarah was nervously checking her luggage tags. Hartman was the center of the vortex, holding a glass of expensive champagne he had broken out for the occasion. "Well, Sylvia," he said, pausing by my cubicle as he headed toward the elevator. He didn't even put his glass down. "Try not to miss us too much. Don't work too hard. We wouldn't want you to burn out before we get back and give you the real work." He laughed, and the sound was like glass shards grinding together. His companions laughed with him, a chorus of sycophants who were too blinded by the glare of the resort to see the woman standing right in front of them. "I'll be fine, sir," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I have everything I need right here." I watched the elevator doors close on their grinning faces. I watched the lights on the floor indicator descend until they were gone. The office was suddenly violently silent. The hum of the computers and the ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds left. I sat there for a long time, looking at the Caliber of Justice file on my screen. I hit save. I hit print. The sound of the printer whirring to life was the first note of the symphony. I watched the pages slide out one by one. 100 pages of truth, ready to be delivered to the place where truth mattered most. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I didn't feel like the caliberless girl they had left behind. I felt like a storm that had spent 3 years gathering its strength in the dark, and was now finally ready to break. I stood up, walked to my locker, and pulled out my own bag. Not the battered one I used for the office, but a small, elegant piece of luggage that had been waiting for this moment. I left the office without looking back. I didn't turn off the lights. I let them burn, a beacon for the ghost of the woman I used to be. As I stepped out into the evening air, a black car was waiting at the curb. The driver stepped out, nodding to me with a familiarity that would have shocked Hartman to his core. "Miss Sullivan," he said softly, opening the door. "The jet is ready." I climbed into the back, the leather cool against my skin. As we pulled away from the firm, I looked at the skyscraper where I had spent 3 years trying to be small. It looked so fragile from here. So insignificant. Hartman thought the quiet office would be peaceful. The descent was a visceral blurring of two lives. As the private jet banked sharply over the indigo depths of the Indian Ocean, the world I had inhabited for 3 years, the world of flickering fluorescent lights, stained carpets, and the metallic tang of lukewarm office coffee, seemed to evaporate like a fever dream. Below me, the Azure Crescent Island emerged from the turquoise haze like a jagged crown of emerald and bone-white sand. It wasn't just a destination. It was a geography of my own soul. The wheels touched down with a surgical smoothness, a stark contrast to the rattling, coughing sedan I had left behind in a city parking garage. When the pressurized door hissed open, the air that rushed in wasn't just oxygen. It was a perfume I knew in my marrow. A heady, salt-etched symphony of crushed hibiscus, damp limestone, and the ancient, brooding scent of the sea. It was the smell of belonging. I stepped onto the tarmac, my obsidian heels clicking against the heat-shimmered asphalt, with a cadence that felt like a heartbeat finally finding its rhythm. Waiting at the edge of the runway was a man whose presence was as permanent as the tides. Mr. Aris, the resort's general manager, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his linen suit as crisp as a fresh bank note. He had seen me through scraped knees, teenage rebellions, and the quiet, stubborn departure that had broken my father's heart. As I approached, the professional mask he wore shattered into a smile of such genuine, unadorned warmth that it physically hurt. He didn't see an adequate marketing assistant. He didn't see a girl lacking caliber. "Miss Sylvia," he said, his voice thick with a paternal resonance that made the walls of my chest ache. Before I could maintain my corporate distance, he pulled me into a brief, fierce embrace. "Welcome home, child. The island has been too quiet without your shadow." "I missed it, Aris," I whispered, burying my face in the familiar scent of his starched collar for a fleeting second. More than I ever let myself admit. "Your father called," Aris said, pulling back to look at me with eyes that saw too much. "He said you were returning not just as a visitor, but as a Sullivan. The presidential villa is ready. I've personally vetted the staff. No one will speak a word until you give the signal." Walking through the resort was like stepping into a living museum of my own secret history. Every turn of the limestone path, every soaring arch of the lobby, felt like a phantom limb returning to life. I stopped in the center of the grand atrium, looking up at the massive, suspended sculpture made of hand-blown sea glass. Hartman had once looked at a photo of this and called it excessive. He didn't know that I had spent 3 months in a foundry in Murano, my face flushed with the heat of the furnaces, selecting the exact shade of cerulean to match the water at the island's northern tip. I hadn't just selected it, I had breathed life into it. I walked past the row of ancient banyan trees that lined the eastern terrace. I remembered the day we planted them. My hands had been stained with red earth, and my father had knelt beside me, his tailored suit ruined, as he told me that a legacy is like a tree. It requires deep roots and a refusal to be broken by the wind. Hartman thought I was a girl without roots. He thought I was a tumbleweed he could blow away with a condescending remark. I reached the balcony overlooking the lagoon, where the coral restoration project was visible beneath the crystalline surface. It was a secret project I had funded with my trust fund over the last 3 years. Money I never touched for myself but poured into the ocean. The vibrant, neon-bright clusters of coral were thriving, a hidden garden of resilience beneath the waves. I had been nurturing life here while my own life in the city was being slowly suffocated. The irony was a jagged blade in my throat. This entire paradise, this ecosystem of power that Hartman spoke of with such pathetic reverence, was a place where my fingerprints were on every surface. The very air he was coming to breathe was air that my family had protected. The floors he planned to strut upon were floors I had walked barefoot as a child. He had uninvited me because he thought I didn't fit the aesthetic of the elite. He didn't realize that I was the aesthetic. I felt a sudden sharp pang of sorrow for the version of me that had stayed away. I had tried so hard to be just Sylvia, that I had forgotten that Sylvia was the one who loved the sea glass, the banyans, and the coral. By denying my name, I had denied my own creativity. I had allowed Hartman to define me as mediocre, because I had left my greatness behind on this island. But as I looked out at the horizon, where the company shuttle would soon appear like a tiny, insignificant speck, the sorrow crystallized into a terrifyingly sharp focus. "Eris," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the surf. "Yes, Miss Sylvia? When the shuttle arrives, I want them treated with the standard executive package. Nothing more, nothing less. Let them see the resort exactly as they expect to see it. Let Mr. Hartman feel like the king of the world for a few hours." Eris bowed slightly, his eyes gleaming with a reflected spark of my own intent. "And you, miss?" "I'll be in the presidential villa," I said, a cold, elegant smile spreading across my face. "I'm going to watch the sunset from the terrace I designed, and then, I'm going to prepare for the arrival of my guests." As I walked toward the villa, I felt the weight of the 3 years of humiliation beginning to lift, replaced by a gravity of a different kind. The quiet storm was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical presence in the room. I had been the girl who didn't defend herself. I had been the employee who let her ideas be stolen. I had been the ghost. But this island didn't believe in ghosts. It believed in the Sullivan name. And as the sun began its slow, golden descent toward the sea, I realized that the woman returning to this world wasn't the same girl who had left it. She was sharper. She was colder. And she was finally mercifully done being adequate. The paradise they were visiting was about to become the site of a very beautiful, very expensive, and very public exorcism. Hartman wanted presents? He was about to find out that when a Sullivan stands in her own house, the very walls tend to listen. The clock in the grand atrium struck 2. A deep resonant chime that vibrated through the limestone floor and seemed to echo in the very marrow of my bones. Outside, the midday sun was a white-hot interrogation, turning the turquoise lagoon into a sheet of blinding hammered silver. I stood in the periphery of the lobby, half hidden by a massive pillar of carved coral stone, my silhouette swallowed by the cool architectural shadows. I had changed into a dress of pleated silk, the color of a storm-tossed sea, and the weight of it against my skin felt like armor. I wasn't hiding because I was afraid. I was hiding because I wanted to see the masks they wore before the truth ripped them away. Then the company shuttle pulled into the circular drive, a blunt humdrum instrument of transport that looked utterly out of place against the backdrop of paradise. The doors hissed open, and the silence of the resort was instantly violated by the sound of corporate chatter, that high-pitched, manic energy of people who believe they have finally arrived at a destination that justifies their existence. They spilled out like a colorful, chaotic inkblot on a pristine canvas. At the front of the pack was Mr. Hartman. He didn't just walk, he strutted. He wore a linen blazer that was slightly too tight, and a pair of sunglasses that he adjusted with the practiced vanity of a man who believed every mirror in the world was currently focused on him. Behind him trailed Marcus, David, and Sarah, their faces flushed with a mixture of heat and a desperate, wide-eyed greed for the luxury surrounding them. Exquisite, isn't it? Hartman's voice boomed, cutting through the hushed, sacred air of the lobby. He wasn't speaking to his employees. He was performing for the space itself. I remember telling Arthur Sullivan, for those of you who don't keep track of the industry's true titans, I told him years ago that this island had potential. It's good to see he finally followed my lead on the limestone aesthetics. I felt a sharp, icy laugh coil in my throat. Arthur. He spoke my father's name with a casual, oily familiarity that made my skin crawl. He had never met my father. My father didn't take meetings with men who managed mid-tier marketing firms in the city. The lie was so bold, so pathetic that it was almost artistic. Does he really know Mr. Sullivan? Sarah whispered, her voice thick with awe. Oh, we've crossed paths at several private functions, Hartman replied, his chest swelling with a delusional bravado. Men of a certain caliber tend to gravitate toward the same circles. It's about presence, as I'm always telling you. You have to belong in the room before you're even invited into it. He stopped in the center of the atrium, right beneath the sea glass sculpture I had spent months agonizing over. He looked up at it, squinting. A bit much, don't you think? A touch gaudy. I'll have to mention that to the management if I see Arthur at the gala tonight. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his career. Each lie made the impending moment sweeter, sharper, and more devastating. I watched them, my coworkers, my superiors, behaving like children in a cathedral they didn't understand. They were loud, they were arrogant, and they were utterly blissfully unaware that the foundation they were standing on was currently watching them from the shadows. That was when Mr. Eris appeared. He emerged from the executive wing with a quiet, lethal grace. He didn't look at the luggage. He didn't look at the fluttering, excited employees. He moved through the lobby like a shark through deep water. Efficient, silent, and focused. Hartman straightened his blazer, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, and stepped forward to intercept him. He assumed the manager was coming to pay homage to the leader of the group. Ah, you must be the manager, Hartman said, his voice dropping into that condescending, I'm a gold member tone. He reached into his pocket for a business card. I'm Mr. Hartman. We're here for the executive retreat. I believe our accommodations are under the firm's name, though I'm sure Arthur mentioned my arrival personally. Eris didn't even look at the hand Hartman extended. He didn't look at the card. He didn't even stop walking. He moved past Hartman as if the man were made of glass, transparent and insignificant. Hartman's hand hung in the air, his smile faltering, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. The silence that followed was sudden and violent. My coworkers froze, their excited chatter dying in their throats. Eris stopped 10 feet away from me. He turned, his gaze locking onto my position behind the coral pillar. He bowed, not a shallow professional nod, but a deep reverent gesture of respect that had been earned through a lifetime of loyalty. "Miss Sylvia," he said, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling with the weight of a decree. "Welcome back. We have been waiting for your return." I stepped out from the shadows. The transition from invisibility to center stage felt like a physical shockwave. I could see the moment the world shifted for them. It was a vertigo of the soul. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It was the sound of air being sucked out of the room. I walked toward the center of the atrium, my silk dress whispering against the limestone. I didn't look at Marcus. I didn't look at Sarah. I kept my eyes fixed on Hartman. The transformation in his face was a masterpiece of human collapse. The smug, oily bravado drained away, leaving behind a gray skeletal mask of terror. His jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to lose its connection to his skull. His eyes bulged, darting from Eris's bowed head to my face and back again. "Sylvia?" he stammered, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. What is this? Why are you here?" I stopped 3 feet from him. Up close, I could see the fine tremor in his hands. I could see the sweat blooming on his upper lip, no longer the sweat of the sun, but the cold, visceral sweat of a man who realized he had just insulted the god of the mountain he was standing on. "You said I lacked the caliber for this retreat, Mr. Hartman," I said, my voice a cool, terrifyingly calm silver. "You said I wouldn't fit in, that I would feel uncomfortable." I gestured to the sprawling multi-billion-dollar paradise surrounding us. "But it's difficult to feel uncomfortable in the home you helped build," I continued, my words cutting through the stagnant air like a surgeon's scalpel. "And it's even more difficult to feel out of place when the name on the deed is mine." I looked over his shoulder at my coworkers. Sarah looked like she was about to faint. Marcus was staring at the floor, his face a deep, humiliated crimson. They were seeing the adequate employee, the girl who drove a used car and wore sensible shoes, suddenly draped in the mantle of a world they could never afford to touch. I turned back to Hartman. His face had gone from gray to a sickly, translucent white. He looked like a ghost that had just realized it was being exorcised. "Sylvia Sullivan," he whispered, the name finally connecting in his mind like a terminal diagnosis. "You're the Sullivan?" I didn't answer him. The answer was in the way the staff stood at attention. The answer was in the way Eris waited for my next command. The answer was in the very air of the island, which seemed to sigh with relief now that the rightful heir was home. "Mr. Eris," I said, not taking my eyes off Hartman's crumbling face. "Yes, Miss Sylvia? Please ensure the presidential villa is prepared. I'll be taking my lunch there." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "And as for Mr. Hartman and his team, please ensure they are checked into the standard garden view rooms, the ones near the service entrance. After all, we wouldn't want them to feel out of place with too much presence." The irony was exquisite. It was a surgical, elegant revenge that left no blood, only a profound, echoing emptiness where Hartman's ego used to be. He stood there, a small, broken man in a cheap linen blazer, realized that the woman he had publicly humiliated was the only reason he was being allowed to stay on the island at all. I turned and walked toward the private elevator, my head held high, the Sullivan name no longer a secret but a crown. Behind me the silence remained, a heavy mourning shroud for the careers that had just ended in a sun-drenched lobby. The arrival was over. The introduction had begun. And Hartman was about to find out that caliber wasn't something you bought. It was something you were born with and something you should never ever challenge. The silence that followed Mr. Eris's announcement wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to snuff out the very light in the grand atrium. His voice had been calm, possessing the terrifyingly smooth precision of a guillotine blade hitting its mark. "The presidential villa," Eris repeated, his eyes never leaving mine, "has been prepared for Miss Sylvia and her guests. Your private staff is on standby, And your father's vintage has been decanted as per your request. The words presidential villa rippled through my coworkers like a seismic shock. To them, the villa was a corporate myth. A 5,000 square foot sanctuary of limestone and glass perched on the highest cliff of the island, a place that cost more for a single night than most of them earned in a year. It was the summit of the ecosystem of power that Hartman had spent the flight bragging about. To them it was a dream. To me it was the room where I used to hide when I didn't want to finish my homework. I watched the disintegration of their reality. It was a slow-motion car crash of the ego. Sarah's mouth hung open, her eyes darting between my sea-colored silk dress and the worn, sensible tote bag she had seen me carry into the office every morning for 1,000 days. David looked like he had forgotten how to breathe, his face a mask of dawning horrific realization. They weren't just shocked, they were ashamed. They were remembering every time they had looked through me, every time they had let Hartman's insults pass without a word of protest. They were realizing that the nobody they had ignored was the one holding the least to their paradise. But it was Hartman who provided the most exquisite spectacle. He looked as though the very air had turned to lead in his lungs. His confident, executive posture had buckled. His shoulders were hunched, and his face was a sickly translucent gray, like a piece of parchment left too long in the rain. The hand that had so arrogantly offered a business card to Eris was now tucked into his pocket, trembling so violently I could see the fabric of his blazer twitch. "Sylvia," he whispered. It wasn't a name anymore. It was a question, a plea, a desperate attempt to find a version of the world that still made sense. "You're Sullivan." The way he said the name was pathetic. It was the sound of a man who had spent his life worshipping a god, only to realize he had spent the last 3 years spitting in that god's face. I let the silence stretch. I let the weight of his own stupidity crush him for a few more seconds. I wanted him to feel the full, agonizing heat of the spotlight he had tried to deny me. I wanted him to drown in the presence he claimed I lacked. "Yes," I said. A single word. 3 letters. It was the quietest sound I had made in 3 years, yet it hit the room with the force of a thunderclap. In that yes, the illusion he had built, the hierarchy of brand names, the theater of caliber, the entire house of cards that was his leadership, simply ceased to exist. "Yes," I repeated, stepping closer, my obsidian heels echoing like a countdown. "I am Sylvia Sullivan. The woman you told was not the caliber for this island. The employee whose ideas you stole because you thought she was too weak to claim them. The girl you uninvited from her own home because she didn't wear the right labels." I tilted my head, my eyes locking onto his with a predatory stillness. "Tell me, Mr. Hartman, now that we're here in my house, how do you find the caliber of the welcome?" He didn't speak. He couldn't. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching his entire life fall into the sea. For 3 years, he had judged my worth by the car I drove and the quietness of my voice. He had mistaken my modesty for mediocrity. He had seen my lack of vanity as a lack of power. He was a man who only understood the surface of things. He lived in the shallow end of the pool, obsessed with the reflection of his own ego, never realizing that true power, the kind that moves mountains and builds empires, doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to brag. Just is. The irony was a living, breathing thing in the room. This resort, which he treated as the ultimate prize of his career, was the place where I had learned to swim. These limestone walls he admired were ones I had helped select the texture for during my summer breaks. The very air he was breathing was a gift from a family he had tried to belittle. He had spent the last week treating me like a floorboard, a silent foundation for his own ascent. He didn't realize that the foundation he was walking on was the very thing that could open up and swallow him whole. I didn't know," he finally managed to stammer, his voice a thin, reedy ghost of its former self. "Sylvia, if I had known who your father was, if I had known the connection." "That's the point, isn't it?" I cut him off, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt sharper than any scream. "You would have treated me with respect if you thought I had a billionaire behind me. But you couldn't find the decency to treat me with respect when you thought I was just a person. You judged my presence by my bank account. You judged my caliber by my silence." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, weary pity. He was so small. So desperately, tragically small. He had all the trappings of success but none of the substance. He was a man made of cardboard, standing in a hurricane of truth. Mr. Eris, I said, turning my back on the wreckage of his pride. Miss Sylvia. Mr. Hartman seems to be feeling a bit overwhelmed by the heat. Please ensure he and the rest of the team are shown to their standard rooms, the ones without the ocean view. I believe they'll find the perspective educational. Eris bowed, a flicker of dark amusement in his eyes. Immediately, Mississippi. I walked toward the private elevator that led directly to the presidential villa. As the doors began to slide shut, I caught one last glimpse of them. My coworkers were standing in a dazed huddle, looking like tourists who had accidentally wandered into a war zone. And Hartman, the man who had reigned over my life for 3 years with a sneer and a stolen promotion, was standing alone in the center of the atrium, looking at the floor as if searching for the man he used to be. He wouldn't find him. That man was gone, evaporated by the sun of the Azure Crescent. As the elevator rose, lifting me toward the cliffside and the home I had tried to outrun, I felt a strange, cold peace. The truth hadn't just been revealed, it had been unleashed. The 3 years of hiding, the 3 years of honesty, the 3 years of being the girl who didn't exist, it was all over. I was Sylvia Sullivan. I was the owner's daughter. I was the architect of my own destiny. And as I stepped out onto the marble terrace of the presidential villa, the ocean stretching out before me like a promise kept, I realized that the most beautiful thing about the truth isn't the way it destroys the liars. It's the way it finally lets you breathe. The following 3 days were a masterclass in the fluidity of human loyalty. A visceral, almost nauseating display of how quickly the world can pivot when the scent of power changes. At the Azure Crescent, the air is thin, flavored by the salt of the Indian Ocean and the scent of money so old it has forgotten its own origin. But for my coworkers, the atmosphere had become a vacuum. They were gasping for a relevance that had been stripped away the moment the elevator doors closed on them in the lobby. I spent my mornings on the limestone terrace of the presidential villa, suspended between the cerulean sky and the crashing white foam of the reef. From up here, the resort looked like an intricate clockwork toy. And for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't a gear being ground down by the machinery. I was the hand that wound the key. The reversal of the hierarchy was not a slow burn. It was an instantaneous, high-velocity atmospheric shift. It began at breakfast on the second day. I had chosen to eat in the main dining pavilion, not to flaunt but to observe. I sat at a corner table, the sunlight catching the gold rim of my coffee cup. The silence that followed my entrance was profound. It wasn't the respectful silence of a leader. It was the terrified, servile hush of parasites who had realized they had been feeding on the wrong host. Sarah was the first to break. She approached my table with a gait that was hesitant, almost limping, her face twisted into a mask of frantic, sweating friendliness. Gone was the woman who had forgotten to CC me on the Peterson emails. In her place was a stranger dripping with a desperate, cloying adoration. "Sylvia," she breathed, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. I just wanted to say how inspired I've always been by your work ethic. We all knew you had a certain je ne sais quoi. A depth. I've been telling Marcus for months that you were the backbone of the creative team. I looked at her, my gaze as flat and unyielding as the ocean floor. The pettas, the sharp biting heat of my disdain, stayed behind my teeth, but my eyes said everything. I remembered her silence in the boardroom. I remembered the way she had looked at her shoes when Hartman called me low caliber. "Did you, Sarah?" I asked, my voice a cool clinical velvet. "It's curious. I don't recall hearing that depth mentioned when you were claiming my research as your own during the winter briefing. I suppose your inspiration was so profound it left you speechless." Her face turned a mottled, bruised purple. She opened her mouth to offer another lie, but the weight of my stare, the Sullivan weight, cut her off. She retreated, her presence shrinking with every step until she was nothing more than a ghost in a floral sundress. Then came Marcus, the man who lived for the executive grind. He tried a different tactic, the "we're all peers" approach. He pulled out a chair without asking, a flash of his usual arrogance still flickering in his eyes, though it was dimmed by a visible, underlying tremor. "Look, Sylvia, or should I say Miss Sullivan?" He tried to chuckle, a dry, rattling sound. "We've had our competitive moments, sure. That's just the nature of the beast. But I think there's a real opportunity here for us to align. My leadership, your resources. We could revolutionize the firm. I didn't blink. I didn't even stop the slow, rhythmic stirring of my coffee. Marcus, I said, and the name sounded like a condemnation. You mistake proximity for partnership. For 3 years you have been a shadow cast by my light. You didn't revolutionize a single thing. You merely navigated the hallways I cleared for you. Power isn't something you align with like a business merger. It's something you earn through the truth of your work. And your work, Marcus, has always been an empty room with the lights left on. The smirk died on his face. He stood up, his chair scraping against the marble like a scream. He realized finally that his currency was counterfeit here. On this island, my father's name was the gold standard, but my own words were the fire that tested the metal. But the most haunting part of the reversal was the silence of Mr. Hartman. He was always there in the periphery, a small, emaciated figure standing by the infinity pool or lingering near the back of the lounge. He had stopped wearing the linen blazers. He looked suddenly shockingly old. The executive weight he bragged about had evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked like he was made of ash. He watched me with the raw, naked nervousness of a prisoner awaiting a verdict. Every time our eyes met, he flinched. He wasn't just afraid for his job. He was afraid of the mirror I was holding up to his soul. He had spent his life believing that status was a fortress. Now he was realizing it was a cage, and I held the only key. The power had been rewritten without a single shout. I didn't have to demand respect. The very walls of the resort, the deference of the staff, and the weight of my own revealed identity commanded it. But there was no joy in it. Only a deep, aching clarity. I watched them all, the people who had spent years treating me like a stepping stone, now trying to turn themselves into my carpet. Their sudden need for my advice, their frantic requests for my approval on petty tasks, their constant suffocating attempts to be seen in my orbit. It was a symphony of sycophancy. And it was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen. It proved that everything I had believed about merit in that office had been a lie. They didn't value my talent. They valued my father's signature. They didn't want my advice. They wanted my mercy. Their truth was as thin as the sea foam on the sand, gone the moment the tide changed. I realized that power in its truest form isn't about the ability to command others. It's the ability to remain unchanged by their opinions. Hartman had used his power to exclude, to diminish, and to steal. He used it as a blunt instrument to forge a hierarchy of fear. I was using mine to create a hierarchy of truth. One evening, as the sun was bleeding a violent, bruised violet across the horizon, I found him sitting alone on a stone bench near the service entrance, the place I had instructed Eris to keep them. He was staring at a withered hibiscus flower in his hand. "Mr. Hartman," I said, standing a few feet away. He jumped, the flower falling from his fingers. "Sylvia. I was just. You were wondering when the axe would fall," I finished for him. My voice wasn't sharp this time, it was weary. "I suppose I deserve it," he whispered, refusing to look at me. "The things I said, the way I treated you. I thought you were just another girl who didn't know how to play the game." "That was your mistake," I said, stepping into the golden light. "You thought life was a game to be played. I thought it was a life to be lived. You judged my presence by what I didn't say. You should have been judging it by what I was doing while you were busy talking." I looked at him, this man who had been the architect of my misery for 3 years, and I felt a sudden sharp surge of the pettas requested. "You wanted to know about Caliber, sir? Caliber isn't the resort you visit or the jet you fly. Caliber is the courage to be the same person in the dark that you are in the light. And by that metric, Mr. Hartman, you are the smallest man I have ever met." I left him there, a shadow among shadows. The 3 days were coming to an end. The retreat, this theater of executive excellence, was almost over. The hierarchy had been reversed, the sycophants had been exposed, and the boss had been broken. But the final act was still to come. The truth hadn't just rearranged the power, it was about to finalize the bill. And as I walked back to my villa, my heels clicking a steady, relentless rhythm on the stone, I knew that the next conversation wouldn't just be about presence. It would be about the consequences of being invisible. The third day arrived with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, a deep heavy indigo that pressed down on the island, signaling a storm that refused to break. I chose the resort's private library for our final meeting. It was a room of dark, ancient wood and the scent of leather bindings, a place designed for reflection, for truth, and for the weight of history. Mr. Hartman arrived exactly on time. For the first time in 3 years he didn't barge in. He knocked. The sound was hesitant, a rhythmic begging for entry. When he walked in, the man who had once filled every room with the stench of his ego looked like a hollowed-out shell. His skin was sallow and his eyes were bloodshot, as if he had spent the night staring into the abyss of his own making. I sat behind the massive desk of polished obsidian, the light from the desk lamp carving deep shadows into my face. I didn't rise. I didn't offer him a seat. I simply watched him, a small man drowning in a sea of his own insignificance. "Sit, Mr. Hartman," I said. The word was a velvet gavel. He sat, perched on the edge of the leather chair as if he were afraid it might reject him. He looked at my hands, which were resting on a thick, cream-colored folder. It was the file I had built in the dark of the office, the caliber of justice. To him it was just a collection of paper. To me it was 3 years of my life distilled into a weapon of absolute clarity. "You've been very quiet these last few days, sir." I began, my voice a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate in the silence. "No lectures on presence? No witty remarks about my caliber? I find I almost miss the sound of your condescension." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a trapped bird in his throat. "Sylvia, I've realized my mistakes. I was under a lot of pressure. The industry is competitive." "Competitive," I repeated, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. "Is that what we're calling it now? Theft? Erasure? The systematic destruction of a woman's dignity because she dared to be humble." I slid the folder across the obsidian surface. It landed in front of him with a sound that seemed to echo for an eternity. "Open it," I commanded. He hesitated, his fingers trembling as they touched the edge of the cardstock. When he finally opened it, the silence in the room became absolute. It was the silence of a graveyard at midnight. He read the first page, the Aura campaign, the timestamps of my midnight drafts, the emails where he had praised my spark in private, followed by the transcript of the meeting where he had claimed the credit as his own. He flipped the page, the Peterson account, the breakdown of my negotiations, the memo where he had described my contribution as administrative support. He kept flipping. His breath began to hitch, a ragged, ugly sound in the stillness of the library. He was reading his own words, the pettiest comments about my station, my wardrobe, and my lack of executive weight. Every page was a mirror, reflecting a version of himself that was ugly, petty, and profoundly cruel. Line by line, his confidence didn't just fade, it collapsed. It was like watching a building being demolished from the inside out. His shoulders slumped, his chest seemed to cave in, and the folder shook in his hands until a few pages fluttered to the floor like dying white moths. "You've been watching me," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "For 3 years you were documenting every mistake I made?" "Not mistakes, Mr. Hartman," I said, leaning forward into the light. "Choices. Every time you stole an idea, it was a choice. Every time you mocked me in front of the team, it was a choice. You thought I was invisible because I was quiet. You didn't realize that the quietest person in the room is often the one taking the most notes." He looked up, and for the first time I saw it, the raw, naked terror of a man who realized the world he had built was a lie. A single tear tracked through the sweat on his cheek, looking pathetic and unearned. "You're going to destroy me," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You're going to take this to the board, to your father. I'll never work in this industry again. My house, my reputation, everything. You're going to burn it all down." I looked at him, and for a moment, the pet as requested flared in my heart. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to watch him lose everything the way I had lost my voice for 3 years. I wanted to see him stand in the wreckage of his life and feel the cold, sharp wind of humiliation. Revenge would have been so easy. It would have been a single phone call, a flick of a match. But as I looked at his broken form, I felt a wave of a different kind of intensity. A deep, sorrowful realization that if I destroyed him, I was merely participating in the same cycle of power he had used against me. I would be using my name as a blunt instrument just as he had used his status. I shook my head slowly. No. He blinked, stunned. No. Destroying you is easy, Mr. Hartman. It's the lazy way out. And frankly, you aren't worth the fuel it would take to burn you, I said, my voice cutting through his fear with a surgical precision. But I am a Sullivan. And we don't just destroy. We build. Or we renovate. I stood up, walking around the desk to stand over him. I felt the weight of my father's legacy and the sharpness of my own pain merging into a singular, undeniable authority. I'm offering you a choice, I said, and the Menahawk, piercing quality of my words made him flinch. You can walk out of this resort, go back to the city, and tender your resignation. I will release this file to every board member, every client, and every industry contact I have. You will be a pariah. A ghost. I paused, letting the darkness of that path settle in the room. Or, I continued, my voice softening but losing none of its edge, you can stay. But the man who walks back into that office on Monday morning will not be the man who left it. You will support transparent promotions. You will publicly credit every idea to its rightful owner, starting with the ones you stole from me. You will create a mentorship program for the very people you've spent years suppressing. You will change the culture of that firm until it is a place where caliber is measured by character, not by vanity. He looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. You'd let me stay? I'm not letting you stay, sir. I'm giving you a chance to earn your presence, I said, my words sharp and minute, lacerating. I want you to feel the weight of every person you've stepped on. I want you to look at Sarah and David and Marcus and see the potential you tried to smother. Revenge is a fire that leaves nothing but ash. Transformation is a labor. It's hard. It's painful. And it's the only thing that can save what's left of your soul. He looked down at the folder again. He looked at the 3 years of quiet injustice he had authored. Why? He asked, his voice barely audible. After everything I did, why give me a choice? I walked to the window, looking out at the storm that was finally beginning to break. The first drops of rain were hitting the glass, cold and cleansing. Because for 3 years I believed that merit would eventually rise above politics, I said, my heart aching with the memory of the girl I used to be. And I won't let you prove me wrong. I won't let your cruelty turn me into a version of you. I'm giving you this choice because I want to live in a world where people can change. But make no mistake, Mr. Hartman. I turned back to him, my eyes glowing with a cold, incandescent resolve. This isn't mercy. It's an ultimatum. One slip. One stolen credit. One condescending remark. And the truth won't just introduce itself. It will execute its judgment. Do you understand? He nodded, a slow, jerky motion. He stood up, leaving the folder on the desk. He walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy and uncoordinated. He looked like a man who had just been handed a life sentence of honesty. As the door closed behind him, I sank into my chair. The intensity of the confrontation had left me drained, my bones feeling like they were made of lead. I looked at the folder, the 100 pages of pain. Revenge would have been a quick, hot satisfaction. It would have touched the surface. But this felt deeper. It felt like I had finally reached into the dark corners of my own history and turned on the light. I wasn't just Sylvia Sullivan anymore. I wasn't just a daughter or an employee. I was a woman who had seen the worst of human nature and decided to demand the best. The storm finally broke outside, the rain lashing against the limestone walls of the library. It was a violent, beautiful cleansing. And as I sat in the shadows, I realized that the most powerful thing in the world isn't the ability to crush someone. It's the power to force them to be better than they ever thought they could be. 6 months is a heartbeat in the lifespan of an empire. But in the sterile, air-conditioned corridors of the firm, it was a tectonic shift that had rearranged the very atoms of our existence. The office no longer smelled of Mr. Hartman's aggressive, predatory cologne, or the stale metallic scent of suppressed anxiety. Now it smelled of rain-drenched glass and the faint, clean aroma of white tea. A scent that didn't demand submission but invited clarity. The transition had been a slow, agonizing exorcism of the old guard. Mr. Hartman had tried. For the first 2 months, I watched him navigate the office like a man walking through a minefield of his own making. He had publicly apologized, A stuttering, gray-faced performance that left the room in a state of clinical shock. He had begun to credit names. He had attempted to mentor. But the rot had been too deep, the foundation too porous. He was a man built for a world of shadows, and the light of the Sullivan Standard was too blinding for him to endure. One rainy Tuesday, he walked into my office, no longer the subordinate's cubicle, but the corner suite that overlooked the city's pulse, and placed his resignation on the desk. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floorboards, perhaps still searching for the floorboard girl he thought he could trample. "I can't do it, Sylvia," he whispered, his voice stripped of all its former brassy resonance. "The truth, it's too heavy. Every time I look at the team, I see the ghosts of what I took from them. I don't know how to be the man you want me to be." I didn't offer him comfort. Comfort would have been a lie, and we were done with those. "Then leave, Arthur," I said, using his first name for the first and only time. "The firm needs an architect now, not a scavenger." When the board of directors learned of his departure, and more importantly, when they finally grasped the full, shimmering weight of my lineage, the appointment was unanimous. They didn't just give me the presidency, they handed me the keys to a kingdom they realized I already understood better than they did. But I didn't take the seat for the title. I took it for the Sylvia who had sat in the back of the room for 3 years, clutching a notebook full of brilliance and a heart full of ash. The first thing I did was dismantle the presence doctrine. I rewrote the company policies with a surgical intensity, excising the vague, subjective language that had allowed men like Hartman and Marcus to thrive while talent withered in the shade. We launched the Transparency Ledger. It was a digital, immutable record of every project's genealogy. From the first conceptual spark to the final client delivery, every hand that touched a campaign was documented, time-stamped, and credited. There would be no more secret weapons. No more back-office ghosts. In my firm, to work was to be seen. Then came the Invisibility Initiative. I created a mentorship program that targeted the quiet ones, the introverts, the modest, the ones who drove used cars and wore sensible shoes because they valued substance over spectacle. I didn't want the peacocks, I wanted the poets. I wanted the engineers of emotion who were currently being talked over in meetings by people who had nothing to say. I spent my afternoons not in the executive lounge, but in the bullpen. I sat with the juniors. I read their discarded drafts. I looked for the hairline fractures of genius that the caliber obsessed would have ignored. I remember a girl named Lorena. She reminded me so much of my former self it made my chest ache. A dull, thrumming resonance. She was sitting in the same corner cubicle I once occupied, her head down, her ideas being refined by a senior lead who was clearly out of his depth. I walked over and placed a hand on the partition. "Lorena," I said softly. She jumped, her eyes wide with the terror of a person who expected to be reprimanded for breathing. "Yes, President Sullivan? That concept you drafted for the Lunarico account, the one about inherited light. Why isn't it in the main deck?" She glanced nervously at her supervisor. Mr. Thompson said it was a bit too abstract, that it lacked the executive punch required for the presentation. The petas, sharpness, flared in my throat, hot and focused. I turned to Mr. Thompson, who was suddenly very busy adjusting his tie. "Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice a cool, dangerous silver. "In this company we don't punch. We illuminate. Ilara's concept is the only reason this account is even viable. If you find her brilliance abstract, it is likely because your own vision is too narrow to encompass it." I looked back at Lorena. "Put it in the deck. Under your name. You're coming with me to the board meeting tomorrow. You're going to present it, because no one can speak for a heart as well as the one that beats for it." The look on her face, the sudden tear-streaked dawning of being seen, was more valuable than any bonus I had ever received. It was the sound of a splintered soul mending itself in real time. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a closed loop. It ends where it began, in the dirt. This was about legacy. I was building a structure where merit wasn't a myth told to keep the workers quiet, but a currency that actually bought you a seat at the table. I created internship programs that reached into neighborhoods the firm had previously deemed unrefined. I brought in voices that were jagged, raw, and honest. I was turning the firm into a mirror of the Azure Crescent, a place where the limestone was strong, the gardens were nurtured, and the views were open to everyone, Not just those who could afford the presidential villa. But the work was minutiate, lacerating, in its emotional toll. Every day, I had to face the ghosts of my own silence. Every time I corrected an injustice, I was reminded of the 1,000 times I had let one pass. I was healing the firm, but in doing so, I was constantly reopening the wounds of my own 3-year erasure. My father called me one evening, his voice full of a quiet, fierce pride that I finally felt I had earned. "You're working too hard, Sylvia. You're trying to save every invisible person in the city." "Maybe I am, Dad," I said, looking out at the office floor, where the lights were still on, but the atmosphere was one of collaborative energy rather than desperate exhaustion. "Because I know exactly what it sounds like when a dream dies in a cubicle. I know the weight of the silence that follows a stolen idea. And as long as my name is on the door, I won't let that silence happen again." I had become the president not to sit on a throne, but to tear it down and build a long, inclusive table in its place. 6 months ago, I was a woman who wondered if hiding her identity had been a mistake. Today I knew the truth. The hiding hadn't been the mistake, the belief that I had to be invisible to be honest was. I was Sylvia Sullivan. I was the architect of the new world. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just working for a paycheck or a name. I was working for the girl in the corner cubicle, making sure that when she finally spoke, the whole world would be forced to listen to her caliber. The storm had passed. The quiet storm was over. In its place, we were building a sun that would never set on the talented, the quiet and the brave. The twilight at the Azure Crescent was not merely a transition of light. It was a visceral, bleeding spectacle of violet and bruised gold. I stood on the edge of the presidential villa's balcony, the same limestone terrace where I had once traced the blueprints with a trembling finger as a student. Below me, the Indian Ocean stretched into a terrifying, beautiful infinity, a shifting desert of liquid obsidian that swallowed the sun whole. The air was thick with the scent of brine and the cooling breath of the reef, a fragrance that felt like it was stitching the tattered pieces of my soul back together. For 3 years, I had viewed this horizon through the narrow, smudged windows of a city apartment. I had traded this limitless view for the gray, suffocating walls of a cubicle, convinced that by starving my heritage, I was feeding my character. I had been so desperate to be just Sylvia, that I had almost let the Sullivan in me die of neglect. A soft, rhythmic footfall sounded on the marble behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. The air seemed to settle, gaining a monolithic weight that only my father could carry. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood beside me, his profile silhouetted against the dying light like a king surveying a kingdom he had nearly lost to silence. "The tide is high tonight," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that vibrated in the stone beneath our feet. "It's aggressive, relentless, just like the changes you've made at the firm." I smiled, a small weary curve of the lips. The petas, the sharp, stinging heat of the battle, was still lingering in my veins, but the minutiate, lacerating pain of the humiliation was finally starting to scab over. I had to, Dad. The foundation was rotting. It wasn't just about Hartman, it was about the culture that created him. It was a world where people were taught that to be loud was to be powerful, and to be quiet was to be a ghost. My father turned to look at me, his eyes older, wiser, and filled with a fierce crystalline pride, searching my face. "You handled it with more grace than I would have. I wanted to burn that man to ash. I wanted to ensure he never saw the sun in this industry again. But you forced him to look in the mirror. That is a far more exquisite form of justice." "It wasn't about justice, not entirely," I whispered, looking out at the white foam crashing against the jagged rocks below. "It was about the girl who sat in that office for 3 years. It was about making sure that her 3 years of honesty weren't just a waste of time. I had to prove that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to stand still until the lies run out of breath." I felt a sudden sharp pang of memory, the image of myself standing in Hartman's doorway, my hands folded, my spirit splintering as he told me I lacked caliber. The memory didn't burn anymore. It felt like a cold, hard diamond of wisdom. For years I tried to separate myself from our name. I continued, my voice gaining a steady, incandescent strength. I thought the Sullivan name was a mask that would hide the real me. I thought that by using it I was cheating. I was so caught up in the pride of being self-made, that I didn't realize I was letting people use my humility as a weapon against me. I was playing a game with one hand tied behind my back, wondering why I was losing. My father reached out, his hand, warm and calloused, resting on my shoulder. It was the weight of a legacy, but for the first time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a foundation. Identity is not a cage, Sylvia, he said softly. It is a tool. A name is just a word until you breathe your own truth into it. You thought being a Sullivan meant being privileged. You forgot that being a Sullivan means being an architect. We build things that last. We protect the things that matter. And we never, ever let the small men of the world define the dimensions of our sky. The realization hit me then, moving through my body with the force of a tidal wave. I had spent 3 years trying to be just Sylvia, thinking that my name was something I had to earn. But standing here on the terrace of the home I had helped design, looking out at the empire my family had built with blood, sweat, and vision, I understood the final piece of the puzzle. My identity wasn't something to hide. It wasn't a secret to be kept in a locked suitcase. It was a responsibility to be used wisely. By hiding my name, I had abandoned the power I could have used to protect others. I had let Hartman thrive because I was too proud to use the shield I was born with. Anonymity hadn't been a virtue. It had been an abdication. I'm not hiding anymore, Dad, I said, turning to face him fully. The wind caught my hair, whipping it across my face, but I didn't pull away. I'm not just the girl in the used car. And I'm not just the heiress in the presidential villa. I am the woman who understands what it's like to be both. I am the woman who knows the cost of silence and the value of a name. I looked back at the resort, the shimmering pools, the limestone villas, the hundreds of people currently sleeping beneath a roof that carried my name. I thought of Ilara in her cubicle, now presenting her dreams to the board. I thought of the policies I had rewritten and the lives that were being changed because I had finally decided to speak. I am Sylvia Sullivan, I whispered, and the name felt like a prayer, a promise, and a war cry all at once. Standing there in the deepening dark of the azure crescent, I felt a profound soul-shaking peace. The 3 years of adequate work, the stolen ideas, the public humiliations, the low-caliber jokes, they were all just the tempering of the steel. They were the fire that had burned away the girl who was afraid of her own power, leaving behind the woman who was ready to lead. The ocean continued its relentless, rhythmic assault on the shore, a sound of eternal movement and unyielding strength. I realized that my life would never be modest again. It would be loud. It would be heavy. It would be monolithic. And I was finally mercifully okay with that. I walked back into the villa, my head held high, my spirit finally aligned with my name. As I passed through the glass doors, the light from the chandeliers caught the cerulean silk of my dress, making it glow like the heart of the ocean. The employees I passed didn't just bow out of duty. They looked at me with a new kind of recognition. They didn't just see the owner's daughter. They saw the woman who had returned from the shadows with the truth in her hands. They saw the leader who knew the weight of every floorboard and the history of every stone. Everyone knew exactly who I was now. But more importantly, for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was too. I was Sylvia Sullivan, the girl who was uninvited from the retreat, the woman who returned as the owner, the architect of a better world. And as the moon rose over the azure crescent, casting a cold silver path across the water, I stepped into the light of my own truth, standing fully, finally, and forever in my own name. Thank you for your presence. In a world that often values the loudest voice, your quiet attention to this story means everything to me. If this narrative touched a chord in your soul, please leave a comment and let me know which moment moved you the most. Your interaction is the heartbeat of this channel. If you're looking for more stories of grace, grit, and the ultimate comeback, please subscribe to Queen's Revenge. Stay brave, stay true, and never hide your light.